This whole creation evolution controversy has been raging on really since the beginning. Because what is Satan's plan? To get rid of God.
Hello, this is Voice of Reason. Today on Debunking Creationists, I am discussing Dr. Ben Carson, a retired neurosurgeon and presidential candidate, who recently made a speech at a religious conference called Celebrating Creation.
I also had an opportunity to have a debate publicly with Don Johanson, the famous archaeologist who discovered Lucy. He's an anthropologist, the so-called missing link. And, he shows this all over the world, this little skull with a protruding mandible and a receding forehead. And I said, I'm a neurosurgeon.
My fellow scientists and neurosurgeons, ladies and gentlemen.
And I operate on a lot of people who have, deformed skulls and things. And, eventually they die and they get buried. And years later, somebody like you comes along and finds their skull and said they found a missing link, But I said, why is there just one of them? Why isn't there a whole colony of them? How can you dig up this one little thing and then extrapolate?
The Lucy fossil is not just a skull. It is a 40% complete skeleton. And her skull is not what makes her remarkable, but rather it is her hip and leg bones that show she was bipedal. And yet she was not human, as she had many primitive ape features, similar to what we still find in chimpanzees. In fact, she shares at least 14 traits with chimpanzees that are not present or different in humans, and at least 22 traits with humans that are not present or different in chimpanzees. And 12 of these traits indicate bipedalism. That proves she is not just an ape or just a human, but an excellent example of a transitional species. And the Lucy fossil is just one of over 400 fossils we have found for her species, Australopithecus afarensis. I really don't know how we can assert that it's a single skull of a deformed human.
I ain't got no body, and nobody cares for me.
Plus, A. afarensis is not the only fossil species showing a transition from primitive ape to humans. There are several others, dating both older and younger, with thousands of fossil specimens.
But I think perhaps the most important evidence for the existence of God is what happens in our own lives. Our own personal experience with God. There is nothing in any book or any university that compares with your own personal experience.
You're putting me on.
The main problem with relying on personal experience to answer any important questions is confirmation bias, the tendency we all have to pay attention to the facts and events that confirm our beliefs and to ignore or rationalize those that don't, as Carson is about to demonstrate. Carson shares the story of his most notable medical accomplishment.
I remember some years ago I was asked if I would come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate type 2 vertical craniopagus twins. Siamese twins joined at the top of the head facing in opposite directions. And there had been 13 attempts to separate twins like that before, none of which had been successful. So I knew it was going to be a great medical challenge. But when I made the final cut that separated those twins, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah Chorus. And everybody had goosebumps. And when we finished that operation, after 28 hours, one of the twins popped his eyes open and reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing by the time we got to the ICU. Within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling. And today, they're in the 10th grade. So that's what happens when God takes over. And see, I know that because I was there. And I saw those vessels. And I said, oh my, there is no way in the world. And yet, he did it. And it's the first time twins like that have ever been separated and remained intact neurologically. So, that kind of experience is very hard to find in a textbook or any other place except in your own personal lives. But we all have experiences like that. And that's what faith is made of. We have to think about those experiences that occur in our lives.
I don't want to take anything away from Dr. Carson's medical accomplishment. It is a great thing that he and his colleagues were able to save those boys and give them a chance at a normal life. But let's put this into perspective. Humans have been on the planet for at least 100,000 years. While conjoined twins are rare, occurring in fewer than 1 in 49,000 births, we can assume they have always occurred, and must have occurred many thousands of times in human history. More than half are stillborn, and many of the others cannot survive long without surgery. And when they do survive, they are forced to live very difficult lives, to put it mildly. Man has attempted surgery of all kinds for many centuries, but anesthesia was not developed until the middle of the 19th century. So before that, surgery amounted to torture, and was usually unsuccessful, and could not have even been attempted on conjoined twins. Fast forward to 1987. After centuries of hard work and scientific discovery by doctors, scientists, and other dedicated medical researchers, modern anesthetic surgery techniques enabled Dr. Ben Carson to perform a great medical feat and save the lives of conjoined twins. And he then gives the credit to God. Carson gives us a great lesson here in confirmation bias, anecdotal evidence, and post hoc rationalization. The unavoidable implication of Carson's claim is that God wanted nearly all the conjoined twins born for the previous 100,000 years and countless other victims of other birth defects to suffer and die, but he wanted these two to survive. This kind of reasoning is truly astounding to me. If you're going to give credit to God, then you have to ask why it took man's ingenuity to solve a problem that God could have solved on his own thousands of years ago, or he could have never allowed to occur in the first place. But Carson's rationalization gets even worse, because he then shares a story about having difficulty selling a house and buying a new one.
And we said, oh gosh, we need to move.
I'll summarize for brevity. After years of trying, the right house to buy, a buyer for the old house, and knowledge of a certain beneficial tax law came together for Carson at the same time, and Carson, amazingly enough, declares,
So there I was sitting there accusing God of not blessing me, when in fact he was blessing me far beyond what I thought. And, it's those kinds of personal experiences that I think make all the difference in the world.
Apparently, God has time to engineer a good real estate deal for Carson, but could not save countless children in the past from birth defects, and even today can't be bothered to prevent 6 million children under the age of 5 from dying each year from disease, disasters, and other causes, or to help the millions of others living life in starvation and abject poverty. In the words of Sam Harris, this kind of reasoning is obscene. Carson gives us a vivid example of why personal anecdotal experience is useless. You have to look at the whole picture, not just the cherry-pick results you find meaningful, to reason honestly. All religious people are guilty of this blind spot in their reasoning. You have to believe that it is part of God's plan that so many should suffer, including innocent children, but for some reason God gives you special blessings.
You go back to the very first chapter in the Bible. And, I'm not a hard and fast person who says the earth is only 6,000 years old. But I do believe in the six-day creation. And Because, it says in the beginning, God created heaven and earth.
From that fateful day when stinking bits of slime first crawled from the sea and shouted to the cold stars, I am man.
Doesn't say when he created them except for in the beginning. So the earth could have been here for a long time before he started creating things on it. But when he did start doing that, he made it very specifically clear to us. The evening and the morning were the next day. Because he knew that people would come along and try to say that, it was millions and millions of years. And then what else did he say in the very first chapter? That each thing brought forth after its own kind.
Life! Life, do you hear me? Give my creation life!
There are different ways the Genesis creation story is interpreted, and none of them fit the scientific evidence, and quite simply cannot work. Young Earthers take the story very literally, and claim the universe, the Earth, and all life we see today came about in 6 literal days, just a few thousand years ago. This doesn't work because of the tremendous evidence we find of gradual, natural processes that took much longer than that. God would have had to have been intentionally misleading, creating a false appearance of age, with distant starlight, erosion, continental drift, and the gradual emergence of fossil species, just to name a few, for that to work. And old Earth creationists, who take the story more metaphorically, think each of the days of creation could have been millions of years. They cannot possibly be right either, because the order is completely wrong. It would mean that plants, which it says were created on day 3, came millions of years before there was a sun, which is needed for photosynthesis, created on day 4. And also, it says the stars were created after the Earth. This cannot work because we know that all the matter that makes up planets, and indeed, all life as well, was forged in dying stars. Carson apparently is a weird mixed-up combination of the two camps, who says the universe and Earth are very old, but creation really happened in 6 literal days. Well, I guess he needs to reread Genesis, because it says the Earth, or at least the dry land on the Earth, didn't come until day 3, and then man only 3 days later. So that still doesn't work. No matter how you twist it, you can't make the Genesis story remotely resemble what we scientifically know about the universe. Oh, and the part about reproducing after their kind? Well, it doesn't take a genius to notice that sheep bear sheep and not camels. But this says nothing about evolution, which of course takes too long to notice in a human lifetime.
There's abundant evidence, geological evidence, that there was a worldwide flood. Go up to the Andes Mountains and see all those fossils.
The evidence shows that the Andes, a range of highlands along the western coast of South America, rose up out of the ocean due to plate tectonics just 15 million years ago, which explains the marine fossils found there. But we only find marine fossils on these types of mountain ranges, not volcanic peaks, or ranges lifted by folding, but not from an ocean environment. Do I really need to explain to a grown man that the story of Noah's Ark is not real? It is so implausible in so many ways, it is truly laughable.
It could work!
No, it couldn't. Evidence from physics, geology, biology, and genetics completely rule out a global flood just 4,500 years ago, for several reasons, but I only need to provide one fact that completely refutes it. There are millions of species of animals and plants currently living on the Earth. The latest estimates are over 8 million. How did the animals and plants repopulate the entire Earth in such a short time and diversify into the many millions of species we see today? They all could not have fit on the Ark. To believe in the Ark fable, you have to believe in a ridiculously fast form of super evolution. Oh, the irony.
You know, they look at all those layers, and then they find some fossils in one of the layers, and they says, this fossil is this many years old because it's in this layer. So that means this fossil is like 1,000,000 years old. And then later on they say, well, this layer is 1,000,000 years old because this fossil, which is 1,000,000 years old, is in it. You know, that's known as circular reasoning. That's how they explain the age of all these things. It's very circular reasoning, and really it has no real scientific validity.
Wow, no scientific validity? Does Carson really think scientists are that stupid? Of course that's not how it works. Carson got only one thing right. We use the layers to date the fossils found in them, because you cannot accurately date fossils directly. But apparently Carson doesn't understand how radiometric dating works. In fact, he doesn't even mention it. See a link in the description for a technical explanation of radiometric dating. But the thing to really note about it is that there are multiple dating methods with overlapping timescales that independently confirm each other, with tremendous repeatability. And also, radiometric dating is highly consistent with other evidence that works on completely different principles, such as dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating, volcanic island formation, and Milankovitch cycles, just to name a few. But the other part of the claim is absolutely not true. Scientists do not use the fossils to date the layers. But I think I know how Carson is getting confused. Geologists in the field use the idea of index fossils as a rule of thumb for quickly identifying layers. Once the time scale of geologic layers of an area has been firmly established by radiometric dating, and the fossils we find in each of those layers are very consistent, you can use the fossils found in the layers to quickly identify which layer you're looking at. The best index fossils to use are common, easy to identify at the species level, live during a relatively short span of geologic time, and have a broad distribution. For example, if you find a viviparous glacialis, you know you're looking at Pleistocene layers about 500,000 years old, because none have ever been found older or younger than that. Of course, index fossil identification of layers is always subject to confirmation by radiometric dating, which would always be used if a new fossil was discovered in those layers. It is not circular reasoning at all. Carson's misunderstanding of dating methods leads him to make an unfounded straw man argument here. And also, I want to point out that the existence of many index fossil species that exist in only a narrow range of geologic layers is very strong evidence for evolution. The only explanation is that they evolved from earlier species and later changed or died out. How does creationism explain these fossils? It can't.
But the real linchpin of evolution is natural selection. And of course, that's a term coined by Charles Darwin. But, he goes off to the Galapagos Islands. He particularly noticed the finches there who had these elongated, thickened beaks. And he said, no other finches have beaks like this. This is evidence of evolutionary change. Now, what he didn't know is that there had been severe droughts in the Galapagos for 3 years. The only finches that survived were the ones that had thick beaks that could break open the seedlings and extract the nutrition, and they were able to breed and pass that trait on to the next.
Carson finally gets one thing right. That is how natural selection works.
Now, I submit that changes can occur within a species. But is that a sign of evolution? Or is it a sign of an intelligent creator who gave his creatures the ability to adapt to their environment so that he wouldn't have to start over every 50 years?
It's due to evolution. That's what all the evidence shows. If it was due to an intelligent creator, he did a terrible job, because the vast majority of species that ever lived went extinct, many for the very reason that they were unable to adapt to their environment, at least not quickly enough. But we see that Carson accepts that animals do change to adapt to the environment, which could be called microevolution, though he and I disagree on the mechanism.
That sounds much more intelligent than anything else, and no one has ever demonstrated one species changing to another species.
No, of course we cannot demonstrate one species turning into another, often called macroevolution, at least not in the way that Carson would want, because it takes a very long time, much longer than a human lifetime, so this is an unreasonable requirement. And also, animals don't ever change to another existing species, as Carson seems to imply, like dogs turning into cats, but rather they gradually become a new species that didn't previously exist, which are always a modified version of their ancestors, and would make it even harder to identify when it becomes a new species. Evolution takes place in small steps, and we can observe those steps. We have observed emergence of new anatomical structures, such as cecal valves in lizards, and new abilities, such as the ability to digest new food sources, and resistance to man-made antibiotics and pesticides. And in the fossil record, we see many stages of evolving structures, such as fins turning into feet, arms turning into wings, and wings turning into flippers, to name a few. Every trait found in living things has evolutionary pathways involving many small improvements, despite their seeming complexity. The only difference between microevolution and macroevolution is the time scale involved. The evidence for evolution does not depend, even a little, on observing macroevolution directly, because there are so many other independent lines of evidence.
Darwin said his whole theory depended on the fossil remains. And he said we should be able to line up from a single cell organism to man, several miles long, and just walk right down the fossil trail and see how everything evolved. And he said the only reason they didn't have the fossils is because they were not geologically sophisticated enough, but that we would be in 50 to 100 years. Well, that was 150 years ago. We still haven't found them. Where are they? Where are the fossil remains?
Where are the transitional fossils? Well, they're hiding. All over the internet, in science magazines, in museums, and in scientific papers. Somebody please teach this man how to do research.
What is this place? Music room?
But there's nothing here but books and papers.
Books and papers?
There are thousands of transitional forms. But no, we don't expect to find every species in between molecules and man in the fossil record, because the process of fossilization occurs only under rare circumstances. Despite the gaps in the record, we have tremendous fossil evidence of many transitional forms, and always in the sequence expected. I've already shown a few, but here are many more on the screen. The fossil evidence is tremendously strong, much more now than it was in Darwin's time. I simply can't fathom how Carson can claim we don't have any transitional fossil evidence.
The interesting thing about evolution, about natural selection, is that it claims that anything that isn't useful disappears. So while a species is in the process of changing, it clings on to those things that allow it to thrive, and those things that are not useful disappear.
Carson just accidentally gave very good evidence for evolution, vestigial structures, but he missed one key point. Unnecessary features in species do tend to disappear due to natural selection, but this can take a very long time. This is why we find many vestigial structures in living creatures today, such as dew claws on dogs, hip bones in whales, and the human appendix, to name a few. Creationism simply cannot explain the existence of these structures. They are clearly the remnants of evolutionary ancestry, and in the case of skeletal structures can be traced morphologically back through the fossil record to their earlier forms. And because unneeded structures go away slowly, they are often co-opted for new functions.
So if that's the case, why do we have kidneys?
But look at what has been done with hearts and kidneys.
Hearts and kidneys are tinker toys.
Because kidney has many components. You know, the glomerulus and renal tubules and all kinds of epithelial surfaces, all of which work together. None of those things in and of themselves have any purpose. Same thing with your eye. You have an iris and a pupil and a cornea and vitreous, and, retina, rod cells, and cone cells, all of which are necessary for the eye to function. Short ciliary nerves. Now, without the other parts, it doesn't work. So how did it get there? Did a cone cell, which is sophisticated in and of itself, just kind of sit around for a few million years waiting for a rod cell? And then they sit around waiting for a retinal network? According to the theory, it had to go poof, and there was an eyeball. Overnight, just like that. Because it wouldn't work in any other way.
Really? I have to explain eye evolution again?
Damn your eyes!
Too late.
Carson is claiming that kidneys and eyes are irreducibly complex. This type of argument against evolution asserts that a complex structure, such as an eye, ceases to function if you remove a part, and thus it could not have evolved, and must have popped into existence all at once. With each case, we can show that this is not true. Carson asserts that the parts of the eye, such as the rod cells and cone cells, must have popped into existence in their current form. This is wrong. It ignores that evolution works not just by adding parts, but by modifying existing parts that serve a more rudimentary function or even a completely different function. Rod and cone cells are specialized photoreceptor cells that work together, but they did not need to wait around for millions of years, as Carson said, but rather evolved from more general-purpose photoreceptors. This is evidenced by the existence of tremendous variation in photoreceptor cells seen across vertebrate and invertebrate species today. They evolved and specialized over time, but before that, they were able to work reasonably well without the specialization. The human eye is complex, but all the parts are not absolutely necessary to provide sight, as Carson asserts. We can even prove this with living creatures. From just a few light-sensitive cells called eye spots, like those found in flatworms, to a concave impression called eye cups, like those found in hagfishes, to rudimentary pinhole camera eyes, like those found in the nautilus, and so on, each evolutionary step from a simple eye to a complex one is represented, and each small improvement provides a survival benefit for natural selection to favor. Sight is not an all-or-nothing proposition, as even rudimentary light sensitivity can provide a survival benefit.
Well, now what about the Big Bang theory? I find the Big Bang really quite fascinating. I mean, here you have all these highfalutin scientists.
All those scientists, they're all alike. They say they're working for us, but what they really want is to rule the world.
And they're saying that there was this gigantic explosion and everything came into perfect order. Now, these are the same scientists who go around touting the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, which says that things move toward a state of disorganization. So now you're going to have this big explosion and everything becomes perfectly organized. And when you ask them about it, they say, well, we can explain this based on probability theory. Because if there's enough big explosions over a long enough period of time, over billions and billions of years, one of them will be the perfect explosion.
No one claims that the Big Bang was a perfect explosion, and organization just instantly appeared. The Big Bang was just an expansion of space and time, and the organization came about gradually due to the effects of physical forces, particularly gravity. Gravity pulled clumps of matter together to form stars, and groups of stars into galaxies. The tremendous pressure at the core of stars caused fusion, generating light and heat, and eventually the first stars exploded, creating the higher elements out of which planetary bodies were formed, also pulled together by gravity. This illustrates how a simple force can and does create what we would call organization. But what Carson is really alluding to is the fine-tuning argument, the claim that the physical forces themselves that are necessary for life to exist are so unlikely that they must have been designed. The biggest problem with this argument is that it looks at the probability in reverse. Of course, every specific thing that happens is extraordinarily unlikely, but something is going to happen. No one can predict, for example, where the next leaf of a tree will fall. Its possible locations number in the trillions or more, and yet it will land somewhere. We would be silly to point to its landing place and claim some mysterious intelligence guided it there. Yet that is exactly what the fine-tuning argument does. It assumes that the kind of life we have is the only kind of life that is possible, and that the entire universe was pre-planned for that life. According to physicists Stephen Hawking and Victor Stenger, the values of those supposedly fine-tuned parameters that are necessary for our type of life are explained by the standard model of physics and cosmic inflation. They are exactly what they should be if the net charge of the universe is zero. And a net charge of zero is what we expect from a naturally created universe. Furthermore, Stenger said that the claims of fine-tuning are based on inadequate understanding of the physics involved and incorrect analysis procedures. For example, it assumes you must vary one parameter and hold the others constant, which is not realistic, and ignores the possibility of some parameters compensating for changes in others. And also, if a God created a finely tuned universe just for us humans, why can we only survive in a minuscule fraction of it? We are just one species of primate, living in a thin film of an atmosphere on an ordinary planet, revolving around an ordinary star in a tiny corner of one galaxy among billions of galaxies. It would be much more reasonable to claim the universe was created for stars or black holes, as there are far more of them, and they can survive anywhere. This doesn't look at all like a universe designed for us. We evolved to fit the universe we have. Indeed, it was about 13.7 billion years before man evolved in this universe. Why would a God waste so much time and so much space? Also, the second law of thermodynamics does not say that all things always go toward disorder. If that were true, every animal growing from a sperm and egg to an adult would violate the law, and every seed to a tree, and every water droplet to a snowflake. If those don't break the law, and they don't, then of course neither does Big Bang cosmology or evolution. The second law refers to the tendency of closed systems to ultimately go toward entropy, which is not the same as disorder, but says nothing about pockets of organization occurring, which of course do occur constantly due to natural forces. It really astounds me that creationists are still making this ridiculous claim.
And I say, so what you're telling me is if I blow a hurricane through a junkyard enough times, Over billions and billions of years, eventually, after one of those hurricanes, there'll be a 747 fully loaded and ready to fly. But, I mean, it's even more ridiculous than that, because our solar system, not to mention the universe outside of that, is extraordinarily well organized to the point where we can predict 70 years away when a comet is coming. Now, that type of organization to just come out of an explosion, I mean, you want to talk about fairy tales. That is amazing.
The hurricane through a junkyard analogy is usually used against evolution, but Carson is talking about cosmology here. It's of course a terrible argument against evolution, because it lacks the critical components of replication with modification. But it's an even worse analogy for cosmology, because the organization of planets, stars, and galaxies is explained by one relatively simple principle, Newtonian physics. There is no intelligent force pushing the objects around in their orbits, just the laws of physics. Of course we can predict the orbits of comets, because they result from consistent natural physical forces. If they didn't follow the laws of physics, then that would require another explanation. Any physical universe will have consistent physical forces, because there's simply no reason for them to change. The comparison of the orbits of astronomical bodies to the inner workings of a 747 jetliner is absurd. Carson can't even get his own bad arguments right.
How are flowers able to reproduce? Pollination. How does pollination occur? Bees and other creatures. Now, according to evolution, plants came along before the bees. So, how do plants reproduce?
Insects help with flowering plant reproduction, but they are not necessary, and not all plants today reproduce that way. In fact, flowering plants didn't arrive until after hundreds of millions of years of plant evolution. The earliest land plants to evolve depended largely on water environments to transport sperm for reproduction, and many still do. But by about 365 million years ago, the evolution of spores and pollen grains allowed plants to broadcast their male gametes on the wind, expanding their range greatly. The angiosperms, or flowering plants, first appear in the fossil record about 145 million years ago, during the age of dinosaurs. They were able, and still are, to pollinate via the wind, but the action of insects, particularly bees, gathering nectar from them and incidentally transporting pollen from plant to plant, provided a new and more efficient way to reproduce. This set up a co-evolution between flowering plants and the insects that pollinate them, with each adapting to the other. Gradually, plants developed nectar that attracts more insects, and produce pollens that stick to the insects' feet and bodies, and insects specialized as pollination agents, with behavioral and physical modifications that specifically enhanced pollination. Since each benefited from this adaptation, natural selection drove it to what it is today, and flowering plants dominate the plant kingdom. But it was not always the case. Plant reproduction is no problem for evolution. Just a little research shows just how silly Carson's argument is.
And what about animals? And what about people and their reproduction? You know, it was a wonderful thing that God gave us. You know, men are attracted to women, women are attracted to men.
You take the blonde and I'll take the one in the tavern.
According to evolutionary model, you know, we really came from an amoeba. And amoebas, they just like split, and then there's two amoebas. So it seems to me like according to the evolutionary model, you do things that are efficient. So rather than going out and looking for a mate, you would just divide, and there'd be two of you.
Before there was sexual reproduction, there was asexual reproduction. The exact evolution to sexual reproduction is not known, but it fits with everything we know about evolution. And some organisms can reproduce either way, such as aphids, slime molds, and sea anemone, showing that a transition from one form to the other is more than plausible. There is at least one known survival benefit which was likely a strong driving force. Sexual reproduction allows for much more mixing of DNA, which can make organisms more resistant to one of their biggest dangers, germs and parasites. If an organism can evolve faster than its enemies, then that can provide a survival benefit that outweighs the disadvantages and inefficiencies involved. Remember that evolution is often like an arms race, in which competition and predation from other organisms, not just the physical environment, can be a powerful driving force to adapt.
But I think the most powerful evidence is the fact that we are creative, the fact that we are compassionate, and the fact that we can manifest love.
Love is the only thing that can save this poor creature.
Where did that come from? In the evolutionary model. Why is it somebody's drowning? For the most part, you're not just going to walk by. You're going to try to throw them something. If you can swim, you're going to jump in and save. That doesn't work in the evolutionary model. Because the evolutionary model says survival of the fittest. You would just say, do that and just keep walking. Most people, they see somebody struggling, there's something inside of them that says, help. That makes no sense whatsoever in the evolutionary model.
Yes, there is something inside of us that tells us to help others. It's called empathy. And if you can't figure out how evolution could be the cause of empathy, then it is simply from a lack of trying. Humans are a very successful species for many reasons, but not the least of which is our ability to work together. In a social species, those that do not get along well with others are ostracized, excluded from the sharing of food and from the protection of the group, and even punished or killed. We even see this today in other ape species, and to a lesser extent some other social animal species. We are the descendants of those that worked well with others the most, because of the survival benefits it provided. In order to work together, you have to have empathy and compassion for the needs of others. And that empathy is still with us today, and we feel it even when the people we help are unlikely or unable to reciprocate. Like a lust for sex or a thirst for water, it is an inherent desire to do good. And knowing empathy comes from evolution does not diminish its value at all. Indeed, if you only do good because God demands it, as Carson implies, then what does that say about you? Morality is just another thing that religion takes credit for without justification. Evolution explains it completely. In conclusion, it is clear to me that Dr. Carson is quite typical of Christian creationists, despite his scientific education. He simply hasn't thought through his arguments very carefully and considered all their implications. He gives way too much weight to personal experience and not enough to empirical evidence. In fact, it seems he hasn't researched the evidence at all. He makes scientific claims about evolution despite having only a cursory understanding of the evidence involved. Once he finds an answer that fits his view, no matter how specious, like the claim that the Lucy fossil was just a deformed human skull, he stops investigating. He fails to recognize and avoid the trap of confirmation bias. He puts great stock in arguments from personal incredulity. If he can't understand how it could have occurred naturally, God must have done it. Carson is a great example of how an a priori belief can cloud your reasoning. If you believe an all-powerful being actually cares about you, then it is easy to ignore or rationalize away whatever contradictory evidence you face. In science, we don't start with a conclusion and try to prove it. Instead, we examine all the evidence, form hypotheses to explain it, and then we try to prove or disprove every hypothesis. Only by doing that are you likely to get to the actual truth. And evolution always holds up to that kind of rigorous scrutiny. All creationists fail to do that, and it is clear when you hear their weak arguments. When you desperately want something to be true, that's when you should be the most skeptical, to make sure you are not fooling yourself. Believers like Carson do the exact opposite. Thanks for watching.
Class is dismissed.